Hello and welcome to this, the fourth of 4 video presentations about the human value of progress. It is called Social Order version 2 and explores the question, what sustained breakthrough progress? In the previous lecture, we looked at some of the characteristics of the West that might explain why breakthrough progress happened there. Now we look at how the increased rate of progress that we've seen in the West was sustained. The answer is that the West culture changed dramatically. Reason, the age of reason no less, led to rational cooperation and social order version 2. The start point was social order version 1. So here's a quick reminder as to how the social order of agricultural civilizations was maintained. The template for social order version 1. Authority. Authority is provided by an absolute ruler and aristocracy. Might is right. Force is applied to reluctant joiners by a ruthless warrior class. It's all about power, mostly inherited. How big is your army, and how ruthless are you in using it to acquire more land and people, to see off external invasion threatening your existing land and people, and to put down internal insurrection? If your might won the battles, you were clearly right. God was on your side, they would probably say. But even if they didn't, who's going to argue with you since you've got the mightiest army? Life for rulers and would-be rulers in those days was that simple. There was something sacred, religious dogma, objects and ritual to provide coherence. The coerced population is provided with a reason to cohere together, something sacred to circle around. And loyalty. There was a king, Tsar, emperor, whatever the title, to whom you were loyal, and your local lord. You were loyal to the local lord as well. There was tribal identity. They became a tribe with their own identity in opposition to the other, to outsiders or barbarians. This formalized tribal identity is intended to mimic kin and clan loyalty, but on the much larger scale required for large-scale cooperation. It's about who is in and who is out. In other words, tribalism. The king, the Tsar, the emperor, the local lord, they embody the tribal identity. This was social order version 1, coerced cooperation, the order that all agricultural civilizations established to bring about the minor miracle of large-scale cooperation and the harnessing of nature. Most people in agricultural civilizations are in the lower castes, tied to the land as serfs or slaves. So it's coerced because people generally didn't want to leave the comfort of their primitive hunter-gatherer bands or small agricultural settlements. Because they were small, these bands and settlements allowed for the natural relationships of kin and clan. People don't usually volunteer to be on the bottom of hereditary caste systems or to become tied to the land as serfs bonded to the local lord, let alone to be chained as slaves. Individually conscious beings with free will and minds of their own generally have to be coerced into agricultural civilizations. Then in the West, around 1800, as capitalism gets going with breakthrough progress, a new social order develops. Social order version 2, rational cooperation. The order that the first industrializing nations, the capitalist West, established to facilitate the next minor miracle of breakthrough progress in pursuit of the control of nature. There were educated populations, consumers, employees, professionals, managers, which meant different social classes and interests all needing coordination. Democracy spreads. capitalism needs regulating. It's complex, requiring mutual restraint. Only reasoning minds can cope. This time, it's voluntary. People need to be coerced into version 1 because it isn't very nice for the vast majority of people. But people flock from agricultural fields and villages to the industrialized factories and slums of capitalist cities. Why? Well, they can sense that the future is going to be much brighter there because of progress. And they continue to flee today just as fast as agricultural mechanization can free them from the burden of field work. They make a rational choice of rational cooperation, even if it means living in slums for a generation or more. How is version 2 social order different to version 1? Other than being a voluntary, rational choice for those who move from village hovels to city slums. Firstly, authority has become rule of law and a meritocracy. Reason is right. The might is right rule of the powerful is replaced by the codified mutual restraint that is the rule of law. How this came about is discussed in more detail when we get to the human value of tolerance and the first video lecture called Rule of Law. And the what you know competence of a diploma-determined meritocracy replaces the who you know power of the gene-determined aristocracy. The age of reason means reason is right. Who can best argue their case in court, or best explain the science, or has the best business idea, or can best describe what must be done in politics? Then they are right. Reason is right. But the state retains a monopoly of force, the police, prisons, military, just in case. Might is right is not abolished, it's just incorporated away from individuals into the nation state. What is sacred changes. Now what is sacred is increasing people's knowledge, wealth and health to make progress with growth, economic growth. The collective worrying about the afterlife in version 1 is replaced with a focus on improving humanity's condition in the here and now, version 2. So what matters is increasing progress, increasing knowledge, wealth and health, humanity moving ever further away from the extreme poverty of nature into which we became conscious. That doesn't mean that religious belief disappears. It doesn't. And many non-believers find themselves searching for something spiritual and transcendent. But for most, their spiritual life is secondary to the worldly, materialistic goal of increasing knowledge, wealth and health. Progress becomes synonymous with economic growth. It's what we, together, as a society, aim for. It's the sacred goal we circle around. And loyalty. What about loyalty? Well, we now have national loyalty, the patriotism of our country, and civic identities. We need to be tolerant of each other. Tribal loyalty is retained to some degree with that national patriotism, but civic identities proliferate as free people find themselves step by step disinheriting themselves from the limitations of the tribalism of their ancestors. Free from the restrictions of tribalism, people identify with their school or college, a regiment in the military, a business enterprise like the company they work for, a profession. A radiologist keeps up to date on the latest developments in her field. An architect maybe socializes with other architects. People identify with their local sports team, a political party, a faith group, a billiard club, For many, it's their family. There are innumerable civic groups free people join and identify with. And of course, people can and do join and identify with more than one. Those self-selected civic identities are exercised in individual freedom of choice and means there needs to be tolerance for each other's choices. Note that the basic template for social order remains the same: authority, something sacred, loyalty. These are three of the moral principles identified by Professor Jonathan Haidt, which we will be looking at in more detail in the video lecture on the human value of tolerance called Politics. But with version 2, what is deemed to be authoritative, sacred, and deserved of loyalty changes. And this change is not made suddenly, but gradually over time. One other thing to note, the American Revolution was not a move from version 1 to version 2 via a revolutionary shortcut. Its main effect was to change from one kind of agricultural civilization to another, exchanging a colonial aristocracy for a local aristocracy. And so, not surprisingly, since all agricultural civilizations are the same, it kept slavery. But it did make an important contribution, I could say first step, to version 2, authority and the rule of law with the American Constitution. And a new loyalty to a new flag was founded in Revolutionary War. As was discussed in the introduction to this video lecture series, and will be returned to in the second video lecture on the human value of science called climate change, it was not only human values that powered the West after 1800, but also abundant energy. So a concise summary of what sustained breakthrough progress might be: social order version 2, rational cooperation courtesy of fossil fuels and human values, progress, increasing knowledge, wealth and health in the West, then across the world. Social order version 2, rational cooperation, is fairly easy to describe, but it does beg one big question. Could human values, and thus capitalism, rule of law, have developed anywhere other than the West? Capitalism is such an obvious way to facilitate risk-taking that it had been dabbled with in various parts of the world before it really got going in the West around 1800. The beginnings of industrialization could be detected in China well before 1800. But before the 18th century, nothing like what we call Enlightenment values were discussed anywhere else except in the West's ancient Greece. Only one agricultural civilization can be first to break through progress, so we will never know the answer to that question. Could human values have developed elsewhere? Breakthrough progress is not going to happen again, so we'll never know if the Enlightenment values, which, if universal as human values, could have developed independently elsewhere. Something about the transition from version 1 to version 2. Coerced cooperation is principally about ruthless control, power. Economics is secondary. Somehow, the political gave way to the economic as we transition from version 1 to version 2. Corruption gave way to trust. I don't know of anyone who has explained exactly how that happened. The Age of Reason, version 2 social order, we get liberals, sometimes called progressives, and conservatives, sometimes called reactionary, and they give us democratically regulated capitalism, or the process of their argument gives us democratically regulated capitalism. Politics doesn't completely disappear with version 2. natural political process. It must be natural because it emerges independently in the sometimes very different national cultures in the West. This natural political process of progressives versus reactionaries has led step by step to the democratically regulated capitalism we know today. This is discussed further in the 5th video lecture on the human value of tolerance, called Liberals and called Politics. The fight for women's civil and gay rights were political moves to continue the transition. Is the transition to version 2 complete? Good question. Social order version 2. Rational cooperation is mainly about the economic. We've moved from the political to the economic. Politics develops into democracy and becomes secondary. So here are 3 of the West's principal economic battles of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, liberals wanted progressive taxation and basic social welfare systems as necessary interventions to limit the market's failures. Conservatives resisted. To combat the effects of the Depression, John Maynard Keynes promoted a role for the state in boosting demand to fight the recession and providing social insurance to limit the recessionary effects on individuals and families. He won the argument, and so liberals became the party of big government. It is not obvious from liberal philosophy that big government is a liberal thing, but since then, big government has been a liberal thing. The second battle. Followers of Friedrich Hayek thought that big government always overreached in dangerous ways. They cited Soviet communism. Hence the emergence of a conservative neoliberalism interested in radically curtailing the state. Again, it's not obvious that conservatives who want a big military and robust law enforcement with lots of police and prisons is the natural home for a philosophy of small government. But that's what happened when the combination of high unemployment and high inflation came together as stagflation in the 1970s. Republicans became the party of deregulation and small government in the United States under President Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher privatized industry after industry in the UK. Coming closer to the present day, the financial crisis of 2008. What next for democratically regulated capitalism? We've tried big government and small government. What next? Note that the Enlightenment values, or age of reason, was not the start of liberalism as some have stated. It was the start of liberalism and conservatism, progressives versus reactionaries, in a long argument that resulted in the democratically regulated capitalism we have today. Some say the West is in decline, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008. So what was its greatest achievement? Greek reason, the iPhone, or the tolerance that led to the abolition of slavery? At the end of this, the 4th of 4 presentation on the human value of progress, here are 2 summary slides. Since the study of human progress is mostly the study of history, human history, not tribal history, human history, let's first draw some general lessons from human history. First one, social development matters, as we see when the more advanced meet the less advanced. The Spanish, under Cortés, defeated the Aztecs in Mexico. They had help with local allies. They did their massacres, just like most agricultural civilizations do, and they had a big help from the smallpox they took with them. It's well known that this relatively small but technologically more advanced Spanish force conquered a powerful agricultural civilization in 1521. In Africa, Bantu Iron Age farmers displaced the San people, who were Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The Bantu were moving south in Africa around the time the Europeans started to settle there. But barbarians versus Romans or the US in Vietnam, it's not just technology. We also have to think about internal cohesion, culture. The barbarians started to get the better of the Romans only when the Roman Empire started to lose its internal cohesion. And who would have bet against the US in the Vietnam War until it became apparent that there was little support at home for the US military in Vietnam? Second lesson, human selection works at two levels, individual and culture. Individuals compete within the group for mates and resources, but social animals cooperate to survive. Similarly, in free markets, companies compete with each other, but internally, each company is a cooperating group. You have competition and cooperation coexisting. Cultural selection in the past has favored both cohesion, look at the unity for cooperation in the longevity of the civilizational state of China. So unity, but also diversity. Look at the rival power centers and competition that drove the rise of the West. What will it favor in the future? The ruling party enforced cohesion of the civilizational state of China, or the ever more diversifying West? Hierarchy is an important factor in the internal cohesion of societies. It is a human universal to treat people differently according to their role or status in society. Historically, it's been order, not individual equality. Interdependence, not individual autonomy. Today, the Nordic Scandinavian countries combine relatively low inequality with impressive social order and cohesion. But they are not typical or average in the West, since they are the richest and not very diverse ethnically. As regards the wider West today, just because something has worked well in the past doesn't guarantee it will work in the future. All the evidence tells us that gene pools, groups, tribes, ethnicities, whatever you call them, they do not compete genetically. Groups do not compete genetically. Racial ethnic identity is always about political power, never genes or science. Enslaving their neighbors, as the Aztecs did in the Americas, or the Kingdom of Mali did in Africa, was about power and resources, nothing to do with genes. Vikings enslaving ancient Britons, again, nothing to do with genes, just power and resources. Ditto Arabs and European whites enslaving sub-Saharan Africans. So social development matters and human selection works at both the individual and cultural level. And there might be a third general lesson from history. War may be a factor in development. Ian Morris, who we met before, talking about why the West rules for now, also wrote a book called War, What Is It Good For? In that he argues that war has driven bigger, safer, and richer societies. His argument is that war creates bigger states as the vanquished are absorbed. These states then become safer because the rulers want people alive to work the fields, or later factories, so they suppress violence in their societies. In a safer society, it's more likely that people will take risks and make long-term investments, so the society becomes richer. But we don't need any more of it. War, that is, because our semi-globalized society is big enough now. Morris suggests that war has been so successful that it has put itself out of business, now that there are such large, sophisticated societies with nuclear weapons. That suggests the current geopolitical situation is stable. But what if that tendency to gigantism resumes? Who will win? The unity and cohesion of China or the liberty and diversity of the West? And the final slide is a summary of how humanity has progressed since the end of the last ice age over 10,000 years ago. We exited the ice age, that is humanity, as hunter-gatherers, super predators. We were top of the food chain. We had groups, we lived in groups, typically 12 to 20, certainly less than 100, around 150, and we cooperated to survive. We accepted nature, we were superstitious. The many gaps we saw we filled with superstition, and we did small-scale harvesting after the last ice age. For leadership, we looked at our elders, the most experienced. They knew where and how to get the meat and berries. There was no such thing as social order, just natural human relationships in small, scattered bands. As for progress, humans were completely at the mercy of nature. Life was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Everyone lived in extreme poverty. Then agricultural civilizations developed with the minor miracle of large-scale cooperation. And large-scale it was. Societies could now be as much as 200,000 people, although most people were slaves, serfs, or members of the lower castes. The thing now was to harness nature, using observation, believing what is sensed. If it looks like the sun goes round the earth, that's what happens. The sun goes round the earth. For leadership, it was the political, gene-determined warriors exerting ruthless control. Might is right. And social order's been invented. The version 1 was coerced cooperation with an absolute ruler, their aristocracy, some religion for coherence, and a formalized tribal identity. Progress, now there was some progress, but only for a tiny minority. But that tiny minority enjoyed freedom unimagined by hunter-gatherers. 200 years ago, advanced industrial societies started to develop. Another minor miracle, breakthrough progress, the acceleration of social development starting in the West. Society again increases massively, up to 20 million people in cities today, or even more than 20 million. And you've got educated citizens, different social classes, interests. We're looking to control nature today. We use experimentation to find underlying cause and effect. We've got the scientific method. We're looking for objective truth. For leaders, it's the economic, the rational, the industrialists, the engineers, the lawyers, and other diploma-determined experts, because reason is right. And we have a new version of social order. It's rational cooperation. The rule of law and meritocracy, progress and growth, national and civic identities. And progress, it's now exponential. Capitalism delivers increasing knowledge, wealth, and health. That means more capacity to act on our own free will, and that's increasing worldwide. These three stages of society can and do exist at the same time, as indeed they do today. There are advanced industrial societies, agricultural civilizations, many transitioning to industrial states, and still a few bands of hunter-gatherers, untouched by social development. One of the most interesting photographs recently was of a North Sentinelese tribesman on a remote island in the Andaman Sea, shooting arrows at a circling helicopter. Social order version 2, accelerated progress, increasing knowledge, wealth and health, with humanity moving ever further away from the extreme poverty of nature into which we became conscious. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the first of 5 video lectures about the human value of tolerance. It is called Rule of Law and answers the question, how does society become tolerant? It can be found at www.conservatus.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservatus, keep safe, intact, save from danger our human values.